These are the 13 worst box office disasters of 1951, when Hollywood lost over $8 million on films that should have been hits. Butchered masterpieces and miscalculated star vehicles fill this list, and together they reveal exactly what happens when studios bet big and lose everything. $1,399,000 vanished on Mr. Imperium, which gave MGM the dubious distinction of producing the year's costliest mistake. No other 1951 release came close to matching that level of financial disaster. MGM believed they could transform 58-year-old opera star Ezio Pinza into a movie idol, and that confidence stemmed from his triumphant Broadway run in South Pacific, which earned him a Tony Award. Pairing him with 30-year-old Lana Turner in a lavish Technicolor production featuring original songs by Harold Arlen and Dorothy Fields seemed like a recipe for success. But here's the thing, the problem started before cameras even stopped rolling. That 28-year age gap between the leads proved impossible to overcome. Edward Epstein's biography of Turner reveals that relations on set became most formal after Turner rebuffed Pinza's romantic advances, and the chemistry audiences expected simply never materialized on screen. Preview screenings turned out so poorly that MGM delayed the release entirely, hoping their other Pinza vehicle might establish his appeal first. That plan backfired spectacularly. Photoplay magazine delivered the verdict audiences already sensed, writing that, despite the grandeur that sweeps from Mediterranean shores to Palm Springs gardens, the story itself never gels, and adding that Pinza is just another middle-aged actor trying to prove himself. $755,000 in total gross, and MGM immediately canceled Pinza's contract. One more film followed before he passed away in 1957, just before production began on the film version of South Pacific, the very show that had made him famous. Inside Straight tried something genuinely ambitious for a 1951 Western by recreating Citizen Kane's innovative flashback structure to tell a gambler's rise and fall through fragmented memories and shifting perspectives. Critics called the result the most tiresome poker hand we've ever seen. $1,282,000 disappeared on this gambling drama. Director Gerald Mayer, nephew of studio chief Louis B. Mayer, assembled a capable cast including David Bryan, Arlene Dahl, Barry Sullivan, and Mercedes McCambridge, and the story followed Rip McCool, a ruthless card player clawing his way to the top of San Francisco society. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times warned readers exactly what awaited them, writing that anyone who has ever played poker with a person who takes all day to make up his mind whether to raise you, to call you, or to throw in his cards will partly appreciate the tedium of a picture called Inside Straight. David Bryan's character created the fundamental problem because the protagonist was written as emotionally cold and impossible to root for. Marketing pushed it as a Western, but the actual film played as melodrama, which thoroughly confused audiences expecting shootouts and horseback chases. Critics dismissed the whole effort as a Citizen Kane wannabe that shares very little with the Welles masterpiece it imitated. Television directing became Gerald Mayer's destination after this failure. David Bryan, positioned by MGM as their next leading man, dropped to supporting roles within a year. 22 screen appearances spanning back to 1929 came to an end with Calling Bulldog Drummond, and this final entry in the famous detective franchise cost MGM $1,052,000, which actually exceeded the losses on the Red Badge of Courage. Walter Pidgeon took on the iconic role for this single outing, filmed at MGM's British subsidiary at Elstree Studios, using frozen funds that couldn't be exported from the UK. Director Victor Saville assembled a distinguished British cast including Margaret Leighton, David Tomlinson, and Bernard Lee, who would later become famous as M in the James Bond films. Critics agreed unanimously that Pidgeon simply didn't fit the part, finding him too formal, serious, and old compared to previous Drummonds like John Howard. Phyllis, the character's wife, was completely absent from the screenplay, and his beloved sidekick Tenny had been eliminated entirely, which meant what remained felt like generic cops and robbers material with the Drummond name awkwardly attached. Pidgeon's tenure as a leading man ended with this failure. The Drummond franchise went completely dormant and didn't return until 1966, when Richard Johnson starred in a Bond-inspired revival called Deadlier Than the Male. What makes that particularly notable is that Johnson had appeared uncredited in this very film that ended the classic series. Hollywood's most famous creative disaster became the Red Badge of Courage, immortalized in Lillian Ross's landmark book Picture, which documented its troubled production for the New Yorker magazine. $1,018,000 in losses hit MGM's books, but the real tragedy turned out to be artistic rather than financial. John Huston cast Audie Murphy, America's most decorated World War II soldier, alongside fellow veteran Bill Mauldin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Stars and Stripes cartoonist. Principal photography took place in temperatures exceeding 105 degrees, with Huston directing the entire film on horseback and sending assistants to Chico, California pool halls to find what he called grizzled sons of beaches as extras. Ground zero in the power struggle between studio head Louis B. Mayer and production chief Dor Sherry turned out to be this very film. Mayer opposed it from the start, declaring, "It's got no story, no women, no love interest," and presenting an ultimatum to Lowe's president Nicholas Schenck with the words, "It's him or me." Schenck sided with Sherry, and Mayer resigned on June 22, 1951. Over 130 minutes filled Huston's original assembly. Disastrous February previews where audiences laughed during serious scenes prompted editor Margaret Booth to restructure the film to just 69 minutes while Huston was in Africa filming The African Queen. More than 50% got cut, and narration was added to bridge the gaps. "The best film I ever made" is what Huston called it, and he remained frustrated and infuriated by the cuts. MGM dumped it as a B-feature, double-billed with an Esther Williams picture. Yet despite the butchery, the National Board of Review ranked it number 2 among 1951's 10 best films. Walt Disney's most personal passion project resulted in his biggest disappointment since Fantasia when Alice in Wonderland flopped commercially. $3 million went into production, but the initial run brought back only $2.4 million, leaving Disney with approximately $1 million in losses on his 13th animated feature. Carol's books had captivated Disney since childhood. Alice's Wonderland came out in 1923, followed by the Alice Comedy series from 1924 to 1927. Serious development began in 1938 when Disney acquired illustration rights from Macmillan. Though a 1939 story reel was rejected as too grotesque and dark, and Aldous Huxley's 1945 script was deemed too literal. All 9 of Disney's legendary old men animators worked on this film, and a $250,000 live-action reference film was shot for them to study. Mary Blair's modernist concept art defined the bold, unreal visual style, while 14 musical numbers filled the soundtrack. More than any Disney animated feature at that time, British critics accused Disney of Americanizing great English literature. Time magazine noted it lacks a developed storyline. Animator Ward Kimball later reflected that the film suffered from too many cooks, with 5 directors each trying to top the other guy. And Walt Disney himself blamed Alice's lack of heart. Never during his lifetime did Disney theatrically re-release the film, and he even actively withdrew prints from universities in the 1960s to avoid counterculture association. The 1974 re-release finally embraced the psychedelic connection and grossed $3.5 million. Today, it holds 84% approval on Rotten Tomatoes. MGM learned nothing from the Mr. Imperium disaster, and Strictly Dishonorable proved it by doubling down on Ezio Pinza with a second vehicle released within months, achieving equally dismal results and costing the studio $664,000. Norman Panama and Melvin Frank directed this adaptation of Preston Sturges's hit 1929 Broadway play. Sturgis himself had pitched the remake with Pinza in the lead, but MGM paid $60,000 for the rights while refusing to hire him for the screenplay. And this time, they paired 59-year-old Pinza with 24-year-old Janet Leigh, creating an even more pronounced age gap than before. Considerably racier content had filled the original play and the 1931 pre-code film adaptation. The 1951 version was thoroughly sanitized for production code compliance, which left behind a thin romantic comedy stripped of its edge. One reviewer dismissed it as a bad sitcom idea. Both Pinza vehicles suffered from the same fundamental problem because audiences simply didn't believe the romantic pairings. When Lux Radio Theater broadcast an adaptation on December 8, 1952, Janet Leigh reprised her role, but Fernando Lamas replaced Pinza entirely, proving the studio had finally learned their lesson about the opera star's screen appeal, even if they'd learned it the hard way. Billy Wilder's first film as producer-director-writer and his first without longtime partner Charles Brackett turned into his first indisputable flop, losing approximately $500,000, despite later recognition as one of cinema's greatest achievements. 19 miles west of Gallup, New Mexico, Wilder built one of the largest non-combat sets ever constructed, measuring 235 feet high, 1,200 feet wide, and 1,600 feet deep. More than 1,000 extras and 400 cars filled the crowd scenes, and Paramount even charged admission for visitors to tour the set after filming completed. Kirk Douglas starred as amoral journalist Chuck Tatum, who discovers a man trapped in a collapsed cave and deliberately prolongs the rescue to milk the story for career advancement. The 1925 Floyd Collins tragedy partly inspired the film when a Kentucky man became trapped and a reporter's coverage turned it into a national media circus. Ruthless and cynical and a brazen, uncalled-for slap in the face of two respected and frequently effective American institutions is how The Hollywood Reporter condemned it. Paramount retitled it The Big Carnival without Wilder's permission in a desperate attempt to improve box office, but the strategy failed completely. Wilder's response to the criticism was characteristically blunt, and the failure scared him towards safer Broadway adaptations for years. Today, the film holds 91% on Rotten Tomatoes and was selected for the National Film Registry in 2017. One of the great forgotten works of the genre is how On Dangerous Ground is now considered. But in 1951, Nicholas Ray's film noir languished on Howard Hughes' shelf for over a year before receiving an unceremonious release. Between $425,000 and $450,000 in losses hit RKO's books. Robert Ryan starred as a brutal, burned-out detective sent to the countryside, where he encounters a blind woman played by Ida Lupino. Ray began adaptation work in 1949, principal photography completed in 1950, additional scenes were shot in August 1951, and the film finally received wide release in 1952. What nobody expected was that when Ray suffered a nervous breakdown during production, Lupino actually directed some scenes herself, though she received no credit. Bernard Herrmann composed an innovative score that anticipated his later work on North by Northwest and Psycho, while the supporting cast included Ward Bond and Ed Begley, with John Houseman producing. That jarring two-part structure confused critics because the film played as half urban noir and half rural redemption drama, and the two halves never quite fit together. Hughes ordered a more saccharine ending that contradicted the rest of the film's tone, and the 2-year delay had destroyed any momentum the picture might have built. Modern critics have been far kinder. Fernando Croce of Slant Magazine called it one of the great forgotten works of the genre that achieves a nearly transcendental beauty in the hands of Ray, and the film has been cited as an influence on Taxi Driver. MGM's third adaptation of Frederick Lonsdale's play, The Last of Mrs. Cheney, came as The Law and the Lady, following versions with Norma Shearer in 1929 and Joan Crawford in 1937. Greer Garson took the lead this time, and $395,000 in losses resulted. Director Edwin H. Knopf paired Garson with British actor Michael Wilding, who played twins in the production, while Fernando Lamas and Marjorie Main rounded out the supporting cast. Walter Plunkett handled costume design, and Sidney Gilleroff created the hairstyles. Casting created the fundamental problem because critics found Garson far too aristocratic to believably play a working-class character attempting to infiltrate high society. One review noted that she has so much class and sophistication that it's impossible to believe she's anything less than an aristocrat, and the role required someone who could convincingly portray both worlds, but Garson could only inhabit one. Nearing the end of her reign as queen of the MGM lot, described Garson by 1951, Louis B. Mayer, her champion, was losing power within the studio system, and her vehicles were generating diminishing returns. MGM withdrew the film from release in 1953 when their rights to the original play expired, making it one of the studio's least seen productions from the entire decade. Howard Hughes' destructive management at RKO turned Double Dynamite into a textbook example of studio mishandling. Frank Sinatra, Jane Russell, and Groucho Marx filmed this comedy in November and December of 1948, and then it sat on a shelf for 3 years before finally reaching theaters on Christmas Day, 1951. RKO's last completed production before Hughes shut down the entire studio for reorganization was this very film. Hughes changed the title from It's Only Money to Double Dynamite as a crude reference to Jane Russell's Anatomy, and director Irving Cummings helmed what would become his final film. Jules Stein and Sammy Cahn provided the songs. Catastrophic describes what that 3-year delay proved to be. When filming completed in 1948, Sinatra was America's top romantic lead and billed first, but by 1951, his star had collapsed so dramatically that he was demoted to third billing. Weekly theater attendance had dropped from 60 million to 35 million during those same years, and the comedy felt hopelessly dated. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times delivered the verdict on December 26, 1951, writing that, "Whatever that sizzling title is supposed to mean, this thin little comedy is strictly a wet firecracker," and adding that, "The 3 stars are marking time, along with the audience, in a slow, dull, and predictable tale." Humphrey Bogart's attempt to recapture Casablanca magic came through Sirocco, produced by his own company, Santana Productions. A similar exotic local romance was the goal, but the effort failed completely despite all the star power involved. 1925 Damascus during the French occupation provided the setting, with Bogart playing gunrunner Harry Smith, while Swedish actress Märta Turen was promoted as the next Ingrid Bergman. Curtis Bernhardt directed, Burnett Guffey handled cinematography, and the supporting cast included Lee J. Cobb, Everett Sloane, and Zero Mostel. Beyond Casablanca read the tagline, which set impossible expectations that no film could meet. Rick Blaine's noble cynicism ultimately led to sacrifice and redemption, but Harry Smith remained genuinely amoral throughout, with no character arc whatsoever. Bosley Crowther wrote that, "The scene is no more suggestive of Damascus than a Shriners Convention in New Orleans." Bogart founded Santana Productions in 1948. And the majority of its films lost money, eventually forcing him to sell the company to Columbia for over $1 million in 1955. Only In a Lonely Place achieved both critical and commercial success. 5 films released in 1951 featured Zero Mostel before he became a blacklist victim. 15 years passed before he appeared in another movie, finally returning in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Robert Mitchum and Ava Gardner appeared together on screen only once, in My Forbidden Past. And this New Orleans costume drama generated more news from its lawsuit than from anything that happened in the actual movie. Director Robert Stevenson adapted Polan Bank's 1947 novel, Carriage Entrance, with supporting players including Melvyn Douglas, Lucille Watson, and Janice Carter. Howard Hughes originally contracted Ann Sheridan for the female lead, but replaced her with Ava Gardner, borrowed from MGM, without honoring Sheridan's contract approval rights. $55,162 in damages went to Sheridan in February 1951 for the contract violation, adding significantly to the studio's costs on an already troubled production. Mitchum and Gardner seemed out of place in the period setting according to critics. Variety dismissed the film as strictly formula stuff about bloodlines and first family snobbery. And at just 70 minutes, the story felt rushed with unclear plot elements that left audiences confused about character motivations. Approximately 64% of RKO releases lost money during this period under Howard Hughes's chaotic management, and industry observers called the studio the combination laughing stock and pariah of the entire industry. The strangest entry on this list is Othello, because Orson Welles' Shakespeare adaptation won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, cinema's highest honor, and then couldn't find an American distributor for over 3 years. September 1955 finally brought it to U.S. theaters, where it grossed approximately $28,980. Filming stretched from 1949 to 1951 across Morocco, Venice, Tuscany, Rome, and multiple other locations, stopping at least 3 times when funds ran out. Welles took acting jobs, including his memorable role in The Third Man, to raise money. Days into shooting, Italian producer Scalera announced bankruptcy, and 2 actresses playing Desdemona came and went before Suzanne Cloutier got the part. Legendary improvisations born from necessity became part of film history. When costumes were impounded by creditors, Welles relocated a key sequence to a Turkish bath where actors wore only towels, soldiers wore armor made from sardine cans, and actors in two-way scenes were sometimes filmed years apart on different continents. That Cannes win under the Moroccan flag prompted the festival director to frantically ask Welles what the Moroccan national anthem was, and Welles suggested they play something vaguely oriental from one of the French operettas. Quality issues plagued the pieced-together soundtrack, which critics noted. What damaged Welles more was that the film cemented the Wellesian myth that he couldn't complete projects affecting his financing for decades. Today, it's considered one of his masterworks, with Criterion Collection releasing restorations of both European and American versions. Revealing patterns emerge from the 13 disasters of 1951 that still resonate with Hollywood today. Star power proved unreliable when Spencer Tracy, Humphrey Bogart, Lana Turner, and Frank Sinatra all headlined flops in a single year. Age-inappropriate casting destroyed both Ezio Pinza vehicles. Artistic ambition without studio support mutilated the Red Badge of Courage, and unprecedented cynicism alienated audiences who rejected Ace in the Hole's dark vision. One of Hollywood's most turbulent transitions surrounded these failures. Weekly movie attendance had plummeted from 90 million in 1946 to approximately 60 million by this point. Television ownership was exploding. The Paramount decree had stripped studios of their guaranteed theater chains, which meant a film needed to gross 2 to 2.5 times its budget just to break even. Several of these failures achieved vindication that their creators never witnessed. Ace in the Hole now ranks among cinema's greatest achievements. Alice in Wonderland became a Disney classic beloved by generations. The Red Badge of Courage's mutilation was immortalized in journalism history. On Dangerous Ground influenced Taxi Driver, and even Othello's chaotic production became legendary. Commercial failure and lasting value aren't always the same thing, and these films remind us of that truth. Sometimes the audience of the moment simply isn't ready for what artists have to offer.